Time pressure illusion. The time pressure illusion is a psychological phenomenon and persuasion tactic that manipulates our sense of urgency by introducing a limited window of opportunity, making us believe that time is running out, even when it may not be. This illusion triggers a heightened emotional response, leading us to act quickly, often with less rational thought, because we fear missing out on something valuable. It's not about actual scarcity, but the perceived pressure that time is scarce. At the heart of this trick is the scarcity principle. When we believe something is rare, exclusive, or fleeting, we assign it greater value. When that scarcity is linked to time, as in, offer ends tonight, or only 2 hours left to decide, the effect becomes even more urgent. Our brains shift into decision mode, trying to avoid potential loss rather than calmly weighing pros and cons. This is where the illusion lies. The urgency often exists only in our perception, carefully engineered by marketers, negotiators, or even ourselves. Psychologically, this taps into several cognitive biases. First, there's loss aversion, the idea that we're more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue equivalent gains. The time pressure illusion frames inaction as a potential loss. If you don't act now, you might miss the deal, the opportunity, or the social reward. Second, it exploits cognitive load. Under pressure, our brain allocates less energy to critical thinking and more to quick decisions, often defaulting to instinct or impulse. Marketers and sales professionals frequently employ this tactic. Flash sales, countdown timers, only 3 left at this price, pop-ups, and disappearing discounts are all designed to create a sense of now or never. In reality, the sale may be extended, the product may be in ample supply, and the timer may restart once the user leaves and returns, but the illusion works. Studies have shown that even artificial time constraints increase conversion rates, because they reduce hesitation. The time pressure illusion also appears in social and professional contexts. A job interviewer might say, "We're making a final decision by tomorrow," nudging a candidate to accept quickly. A person trying to influence a decision might say, "This opportunity won't be around for long," nudging others to commit without full deliberation. However, while this technique can be effective in moving people to act, it can also lead to regret, impulsive choices, or resistance if it feels manipulative. If someone senses that urgency is being artificially manufactured, trust can erode quickly. That's why the most effective use of this tactic is when some element of urgency is real or justifiable, and the person using it is transparent about what's at stake. In personal development, the time pressure illusion can even be self-imposed to overcome procrastination. Setting artificial deadlines, using timers, or creating time-based challenges can create productive urgency, as long as you're aware that it's a tool, not a trap. In essence, the time pressure illusion shows how easily the perception of time, not time itself, can shape our decisions. It's a reminder that urgency, like fear, is often a feeling more than a fact. And whether you're using this trick or protecting yourself from it, the real power lies in recognizing when time pressure is authentic, and when it's just an illusion designed to rush you past your better judgment. The Benjamin Franklin Effect. The Benjamin Franklin effect is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that turns our assumptions about kindness and favor on their head. Common sense suggests that if we do a favor for someone, we must already like them. But the Benjamin Franklin effect proposes the opposite. We tend to grow to like someone more after we do a favor for them, even if we didn't particularly like them beforehand. This counterintuitive insight is named after Benjamin Franklin himself, who famously used it in his political life. According to his autobiography, Franklin once dealt with a rival legislator who held a grudge against him. Rather than confronting the animosity or trying to win him over with flattery, Franklin instead asked the man if he could borrow a rare and valuable book from his personal library. The rival obliged. After Franklin returned the book with a note of thanks, the man began treating him with warmth and respect, and they eventually became friends. Franklin's interpretation: he that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. Psychologically, this effect is a result of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two conflicting beliefs. In this case, the conflict is, I don't like this person, versus, I just did something nice for them. To resolve this internal contradiction, the brain adjusts the first belief. The subconscious logic becomes, if I help them, maybe I actually like them. This adjustment restores harmony and reduces the discomfort caused by the inconsistency. The Benjamin Franklin effect demonstrates how our behavior can shape our attitudes, not just the other way around. It has meaningful implications in social relationships, leadership, and persuasion. For example, instead of trying to win someone over by giving them gifts or doing favors, which can sometimes create awkwardness or a sense of debt, asking them to help you with something small, like advice, feedback, or assistance, can ironically bring you closer. However, it's important that the request is appropriate and sincere. A favor that feels manipulative or disproportionate can backfire. But when asked in a genuine, respectful way, it not only flatters the person by showing that you value their help, but also triggers this subtle shift in how they perceive you. In a world where relationships are often built on favors, exchanges, and reciprocity, the Benjamin Franklin effect reminds us that sometimes, the most effective way to make someone like you isn't by giving, it's by asking. Door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face technique is a clever and counterintuitive psychological strategy that involves making an initially large and unreasonable request, fully expecting it to be rejected, and then immediately following it with a much smaller, more reasonable request, the one you actually wanted all along. The contrast between the two requests creates a powerful psychological shift in the listener's perception, dramatically increasing the likelihood that they'll agree to the second proposal. At the heart of this technique is the principle of reciprocity, one of the most deeply ingrained social norms in human behavior. When someone makes a concession, even a symbolic one, we feel a subtle pressure to reciprocate in kind. So, when you retreat from a big request to a smaller one, the listener unconsciously interprets that as a form of compromise. To meet you halfway, they become more inclined to say yes to the second, more modest request. For example, imagine a fundraiser approaches you on the street and asks, "Would you be willing to donate $100 to help fund our campaign?" You decline. That's a steep request. Then they follow with, "Okay, no problem, even $10 would make a real difference." Now, in comparison, the $10 seems far more reasonable, even though you might not have considered giving anything at all before the interaction. You're more likely to agree, not because you suddenly feel generous, but because of the psychological contrast and the perceived give-and-take dynamic. This technique was first studied in the 1970s by psychologist Robert Cialdini and his colleagues. In one experiment, they asked students to spend 2 hours a week for 2 years volunteering with troubled youth. Nearly everyone refused. Then, the researchers asked if they'd be willing to chaperone a single group of kids on a one-day zoo trip. About 50% agreed to the smaller request, compared to just 17% of students who were only asked the small favor directly. The initial door in the face created a cognitive opening for compliance. Importantly, the door in the face technique doesn't work if the initial request is completely absurd or if the second request is unrelated. The two must feel logically or emotionally connected. The effectiveness also depends on the speed of the retreat. The smaller request should follow immediately, so the contrast is fresh in the person's mind. This approach is widely used in negotiation, sales, marketing, and even parenting. A child who wants a later bedtime might first ask to stay up until midnight, knowing the answer will be no, then suggest 10 p.m., which suddenly feels like a compromise. In customer service, a company might propose a premium package first, then downgrade to a basic one, making it feel like a win for the customer. In essence, the door-in-the-face technique doesn't rely on the logic of the request, it relies on how the request is framed. By first making a request that's almost certain to be refused, and then stepping back to something more acceptable, you trigger a reflex of cooperation and fairness, making people more likely to say yes, not because they must, but because they feel they should. The contrast principle. The contrast principle is a psychological phenomenon that affects the way we perceive differences between things presented in sequence. It states that when two items are compared one after the other, the differences between them tend to appear more pronounced than they actually are. Our minds don't evaluate things in isolation, we judge them relative to what came just before. As a result, the order in which information is presented can dramatically shape our perception, preferences, and decisions. To illustrate this, imagine walking into a room on a cold winter day. At first, the room feels warm. Now imagine entering the same room after being in a hot sauna. Suddenly, the very same temperature feels cool. The room hasn't changed, you have. That's the contrast principle in action. What we perceive depends on what we experienced just before. This principle is widely used in marketing, sales, and negotiation. For example, a salesperson might first show a customer a very expensive item, like a $5,000 designer sofa, and then show a $2,500 sofa. The second option suddenly feels much more affordable, even if it's still quite costly. Had it been shown first, it might have been rejected outright. But against the backdrop of the $5,000 anchor, it now seems reasonable, even appealing. The contrast amplifies its attractiveness. Psychologically, this effect hinges on how the brain interprets sensory and evaluative information. We are naturally inclined to look for reference points, and the first thing we experience becomes that reference, whether it's a price, a mood, a person, or a performance. Everything that follows is judged in comparison. The bigger the difference, the stronger the contrast effect. The contrast principle also shows up in social contexts. A person may seem more attractive if surrounded by less attractive individuals, or a job offer might seem more desirable after reviewing less appealing ones. In persuasion, a speaker may intentionally precede their main argument with a weak one from the opposing side, so that their position appears stronger by contrast. Importantly, this principle can be manipulated deliberately or occur unintentionally. Skilled communicators, from lawyers to marketers to negotiators, often use contrast strategically to guide perception. But it can also bias judgment in subtle, unconscious ways. For example, after reading a tragic news story, even a mildly sad event might feel more intense than it otherwise would. The emotional contrast exaggerates our response. In practical terms, the contrast principle teaches us that perception is relative, not absolute. Whether we're judging value, beauty, fairness, or risk, our opinions are shaped not just by what's in front of us, but by what we saw just before. Being aware of this bias can help us make more rational decisions, and better understand how others may be nudging our perceptions without us even realizing it. Anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is a powerful psychological phenomenon that shapes how people make decisions, especially when estimating values, judging quantities, or negotiating outcomes. At its core, it refers to the tendency for individuals to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making judgments or choices. Even if that initial reference point is arbitrary or irrelevant, it can exert a disproportionate influence on subsequent thinking. Imagine you walk into a store and see a jacket priced at $300, then discover another one for $150. The second jacket suddenly seems like a bargain, not because of its quality or value, but because your brain is subconsciously comparing it to the original $300 anchor. If, however, you had seen the $150 jacket first, you might have considered it expensive. This mental bias is the essence of the anchoring effect. Once an anchor is set, all future evaluations are adjusted relative to it, even if the anchor has no real bearing on the actual value. This effect has been repeatedly demonstrated in psychological research. In one famous experiment by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, participants spun a wheel rigged to stop at either 10 or 65, and were then asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who landed on 65 gave significantly higher estimates than those who landed on 10, even though the spinning wheel had no logical connection to the question. The random number acted as a cognitive anchor, silently influencing their perception of what a reasonable answer might be. The anchoring effect plays a central role in negotiations, pricing strategies, and decision-making. In business, the first price thrown out, even if wildly high, can set the tone for the entire discussion. That's why savvy negotiators often try to make the first offer, knowing it will serve as the anchor around which all future counteroffers revolve. Similarly, in retail, products are often listed with a high, original price / to a discounted rate. The original price, though possibly inflated, anchors the buyer's perception of value and makes the sale price seem more attractive. Even outside financial contexts, anchoring can distort how we judge people, assess risks, or make moral evaluations. First impressions, for instance, can serve as anchors in how we perceive someone's personality, even if later evidence contradicts that initial impression. Importantly, the anchoring effect works on both the conscious and subconscious levels. Even when we know that a number is random or arbitrary, its mere presence can still influence our thinking. That's what makes it so insidious, and so useful, depending on how it's employed. In short, the anchoring effect reveals just how vulnerable human judgment is to context and framing. The first number we see, the first piece of data we hear, or the first impression we form can become the mental reference point from which all subsequent thoughts are distorted. Whether you're buying, selling, negotiating, or simply making a decision, being aware of this bias can help you recognize when you're being influenced, and when you're unintentionally influencing others. The power of silence. In conversation, silence is often seen as awkward or uncomfortable, something to be quickly filled with words. But this discomfort is precisely what makes silence such a powerful psychological tool. Known as the power of silence, this technique involves deliberately withholding a response after asking a question or hearing an answer, allowing the silence to linger just a moment longer than feels natural. In that space, something subtle yet profound happens. the other person, feeling the pressure of the quiet, often continue speaking, revealing more than they initially intended. This response stems from deeply ingrained social norms. Most people are conditioned to maintain a steady flow in conversation, and silence feels like a disruption of that rhythm. When someone is met with stillness instead of affirmation or interruption, they begin to fill the gap, often offering additional thoughts, clarifications, or even truths they might otherwise withhold. Psychologically, silence creates a moment of introspection. The absence of immediate feedback causes people to reflect more deeply on what they've said. In doing so, they might reveal their genuine thoughts, emotions, or motivations, especially if the silence follows a probing or emotionally charged question. Used skillfully, this technique can build trust, uncover hidden information, or prompt self-discovery. Therapists, negotiators, interviewers, and even skilled friends or leaders often use silence not as absence, but as presence, a quiet space that invites honesty. It is not passive, but intentional. In an age saturated with noise and instant responses, silence can speak louder than words. Expectations shape perception. The psychological trick known as expectations shape perception refers to the powerful way in which our beliefs, assumptions, and prior expectations influence how we interpret and experience the world. In simple terms, what we expect to happen often colors what we actually perceive, sometimes altering our judgments, emotions, and even physical sensations. This effect is so profound that our expectations can shape reality itself, or at least our subjective experience of it. Psychologists call this phenomenon perceptual expectancy, a process in which the brain uses prior knowledge or context to interpret ambiguous information. Rather than passively recording objective facts, the human mind constantly filters and reconstructs reality through the lens of expectation. This can affect everything from how food tastes, to how pain feels, to how we judge other people's behavior. One striking example of this effect is found in a classic wine tasting experiment. Participants were given the same wine but told that one sample was expensive and the other was cheap. Even experienced wine drinkers rated the expensive wine as tasting better, despite it being identical. Their expectation of quality shaped their sensory experience. Similar effects have been shown in experiments with medications, the placebo effect, where patients report real improvements in symptoms after taking inert pills, simply because they believe the treatment will work. In interpersonal contexts, expectations can shape how we perceive others' personalities or behavior. If you're told someone is kind and warm before meeting them, you're more likely to interpret their actions through that positive lens, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Conversely, if you expect someone to be rude or cold, your perception will likely confirm that belief, even if their behavior is neutral. This is closely related to the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where expectations not only shape perception, but also influence outcomes by altering how we act and react. Marketers, educators, leaders, and influencers often use this psychological principle deliberately. A teacher who tells students a lesson will be exciting and useful can raise engagement simply by planting the expectation that it's worth paying attention to. A company that frames a product as premium or exclusive can influence customer satisfaction, even before the product is used. The framing creates a mental filter, and perception tends to follow that frame. Even emotions and pain responses are susceptible. Studies show that when people are told a mild stimulus will hurt, they often report more pain than when no expectation is set. The brain is essentially preparing for discomfort, and creates it, even when it might not be inherently there. However, while this psychological trick can be harnessed for positive effects, enhancing learning, motivation, or healing, it also comes with risks. Negative expectations can become mental traps, making situations seem worse than they are or reinforcing anxiety, pessimism, or bias. What we expect, we tend to see, and sometimes, that means we miss what's really there. In essence, expectation is not a passive mental state, it is an active shaper of experience. When we anticipate how something will feel, taste, unfold, or turn out, that anticipation becomes a lens through which reality is filtered. Understanding this dynamic allows us not only to influence others more skillfully, but also to challenge and reset our own assumptions, so we don't become prisoners of perception shaped by faulty belief. Foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique is a classic psychological strategy used to influence behavior through a process of gradual commitment. It works by first securing agreement to a small, easy request, and then following it with a larger, related request, the one you truly wanted all along. By saying yes to the first ask, a person becomes more likely to agree to the second, more significant one. This method is rooted in the principle of consistency, one of the core drivers of human behavior. People generally like to see themselves as consistent in their actions and beliefs. Once someone commits to something, even if it's minor, they begin to perceive themselves in a way that aligns with that action. So, when a second request is made that fits with this self-image, they feel a psychological urge to remain consistent and comply again. In other words, our behavior shapes our identity, and our identity then guides future behavior. For example, a charity fundraiser might first ask, "Would you be willing to sign a petition supporting clean water access?" Most people will agree, it's a low-effort, low-risk request. A few days later, the same group may call back and ask, "Would you consider making a donation to support the cause you just endorsed?" Because the person has already taken a public stand, they are now more likely to say yes to the second, larger request, donating money, in order to remain consistent with their earlier action. This technique was famously demonstrated in a 1966 experiment by psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser. They asked homeowners to place a small, innocuous sign in their windows about safe driving. 2 weeks later, they asked the same group to put a large, unattractive billboard on their lawns with the same message. Compared to a control group who hadn't been approached before, those who agreed to the small sign were significantly more likely to comply with the larger request. The initial foot in the door opened the way to further compliance. The foot in the door technique is commonly used in sales, marketing, activism, and everyday persuasion. Telemarketers, for instance, might begin by asking a simple survey question before making a product pitch. Recruiters might start with, "Can I ask you one quick thing?" before inviting someone to apply or attend a meeting. Even in personal relationships, asking a small favor, like borrowing a pen, can pave the way to bigger requests later. However, it only works effectively when the initial request feels voluntary and non-coercive. If people feel manipulated or pressured from the start, the desire to maintain consistency won't take hold, and resistance may increase instead. In essence, the foot in the door technique is less about the content of the request and more about creating a psychological momentum. Once a person takes a small step in a certain direction, they are far more likely to keep walking that path, even when the stakes get higher. Give choices, not commands. The psychological trick of "give choices, not commands" is a subtle yet powerful strategy for guiding behavior while preserving a sense of autonomy. Instead of issuing direct orders, which can provoke resistance or defensiveness, this technique involves offering people two or more options that all lead toward the desired outcome. The person still feels in control, even though the available choices have been carefully shaped. At its core, this method taps into the human need for agency, the feeling that we are making decisions for ourselves. When people feel they are being told what to do, especially in a commanding or authoritarian tone, their natural reaction is often to push back or resist, even if the request is reasonable. This resistance isn't always conscious or rational. It's rooted in a psychological phenomenon known as reactance, a defensive response triggered when people perceive their freedom of choice is being threatened. By giving choices, you short-circuit this defensive reflex. Instead of saying, "Clean your room now," you might say, "Do you want to clean your room before or after dinner?" The task remains the same, but the child, or employee, partner, or customer, is now engaged in a decision-making process rather than feeling forced into obedience. The outcome is still guided, but the path is chosen, giving the person a sense of ownership over their actions. This technique is especially effective in leadership, parenting, teaching, customer service, and negotiation. A manager might say, "Would you prefer to work on the report or handle the client emails this afternoon?" instead of simply assigning a task. A teacher might ask, "Would you rather write about topic A or topic B?" rather than demanding one topic be used. In each case, offering limited, structured choices fosters cooperation rather than resistance. From a psychological standpoint, this approach also enhances engagement and motivation. When people choose a path themselves, even from a limited menu of options, they are more invested in the outcome. The decision becomes personal, not imposed. Research in motivation theory consistently shows that intrinsic motivation, the drive that comes from within, increases when people feel they have a voice in how things are done. However, the choices given must be genuine and fair. If the options are manipulative or clearly skewed toward a single, acceptable answer, people may sense the deception and feel more controlled than empowered. The goal is to frame decisions in a way that aligns both your goals and the other person's sense of autonomy. In essence, Give Choices, Not Commands, is about guiding behavior through cooperation, not control. It shifts the tone from demand to dialogue, from compliance to collaboration. And in doing so, it not only reduces resistance, it strengthens relationships and promotes a healthier, more respectful dynamic where everyone feels heard. Labeling Technique. The labeling technique is a subtle but powerful psychological trick that involves assigning a positive identity or trait to someone in advance, with the intention that they will then act in ways consistent with that label. It leverages a core aspect of human behavior. People are highly motivated to behave in ways that align with how they see themselves, especially if that self-image has been publicly affirmed or socially reinforced. At its heart, the labeling technique works by tapping into our desire for consistency. Once a person is told they are a certain type of person, thoughtful, generous, responsible, honest, they are more likely to live up to that label, particularly if it comes from a respected source or is delivered in a flattering context. This is because we generally like to see ourselves in a positive light, and we want our actions to match our perceived identity. For example, in a classic study on voting behavior, researchers told a group of citizens, "Based on your past behavior, we believe you are the type of person who is likely to vote." That subtle labeling, even though it wasn't based on any actual data, led to significantly higher voter turnout among that group. Why? Because people internalize the label and wanted to act consistently with it. This technique is often used in marketing and customer service. A salesperson might say, "You seem like someone who appreciates quality," before introducing a premium product. A customer who is told, "You're one of our most loyal and thoughtful clients," is more likely to continue that behavior, making repeat purchases, leaving reviews, or remaining loyal to the brand. In everyday life, the labeling technique can also strengthen relationships and improve behavior. A teacher who says to a student, "You're the kind of person who always puts in effort, even when things are tough," subtly encourages persistence. A parent who tells a child, "You're really good at sharing with others," increases the likelihood that the child will continue to do so, because now it's part of their identity. Importantly, for labeling to be effective, it should be believable and positive. If the label is too exaggerated or feels manipulative, it can create skepticism or even provoke the opposite behavior. People don't like being boxed in or flattered dishonestly. But when the label is delivered genuinely and respectfully, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the label changes who the person is, but because it guides how they choose to act. The labeling technique also works because it offers a shortcut to affirmation and status. Being labeled as smart, generous, or capable makes people feel seen and respected, and they naturally want to protect and reinforce that positive identity in the eyes of others. In essence, the labeling technique is not about forcing people into roles, it's about inviting them to see the best in themselves, and then letting that vision guide their choices. When used with sincerity and subtlety, it becomes a powerful tool for motivation, persuasion, and social influence, one that works by aligning identity and action. Loss aversion framing. Loss aversion framing is a psychological strategy that leverages one of the most powerful cognitive biases in human decision-making, our instinctive tendency to fear losses more than we value gains. This principle, known as loss aversion, suggests that the pain of losing something is psychologically stronger than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. When information is presented in terms of what someone might lose rather than what they might gain, it often triggers stronger emotional responses and increases the likelihood of action. The idea was first formally introduced by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky as part of their groundbreaking work on prospect theory. They demonstrated that people are generally more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue equivalent gains. For example, most people would prefer not to lose $100 than to gain $100, even though the amounts are objectively the same. The emotional impact of a loss is greater, and this asymmetry can be used to guide behavior. In practical terms, loss aversion framing is about how a message is constructed. Consider two ways of promoting the same outcome. Gain framed: if you buy this insurance policy, you'll be protected in case of an accident. Loss framed: without this insurance, you could lose everything in an accident. Both statements describe the same reality, the presence or absence of protection, but the second frames it as a potential loss, which feels more urgent and threatening. People are more likely to take action when they perceive that inaction will cost them something. This technique is widely used in marketing, health communication, negotiation, and behavior change campaigns. For example, in sales, "You'll miss out on this offer if you don't act today." In health, "If you don't exercise, you increase your risk of disease." In finance, failing to invest now could mean losing years of compound interest. Loss aversion framing is especially effective when decisions are complex, ambiguous, or emotionally charged, times when people are already risk-sensitive and looking for guidance. It can cut through hesitation and motivate immediate action by shifting the psychological focus from potential gain, which feels optional, to potential loss, which feels dangerous. Importantly, this strategy must be used ethically. While loss-based framing is persuasive, overuse or manipulation can breed fear, stress, or resentment. The goal is to guide informed decision-making, not to exploit emotions. When used wisely, it can help people make proactive choices in areas they might otherwise ignore, like health, safety, or financial planning. In essence, loss aversion framing doesn't change the facts, it changes the emphasis. By highlighting what might be lost instead of what could be gained, it taps into a primal part of the human psyche, the drive to protect what we have. And in doing so, it transforms hesitation into urgency, and intention into action. Mirroring. Mirroring is a subtle yet powerful psychological technique rooted in the natural human desire for connection and belonging. It involves unconsciously, or deliberately, imitating another person's gestures, posture, tone of voice, speech patterns, or even emotional expressions during a social interaction. When done skillfully and subtly, mirroring creates a sense of familiarity and rapport, making the other person feel seen, heard, and understood. At the heart of mirroring lies a basic social truth: we are drawn to people who are like us. This is partly due to the principle of similarity, a well-documented phenomenon in social psychology that suggests people are more likely to trust, like, and feel empathy toward those they perceive as similar. By reflecting someone's behavior back to them, you non-verbally signal that you are in sync, that you are attuned to their emotional state and rhythm of communication. As a result, they feel more comfortable, more validated, and more open. Neurologically, mirroring may be linked to the activity of mirror neurons, which fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. These neurons are thought to play a role in empathy and social bonding, helping us understand and internalize the feelings and intentions of others. When someone subtly mirrors us, we often don't consciously notice it, but we feel more connected and aligned with them. The interaction feels smoother, more natural, as if we're on the same wavelength. Mirroring is commonly used by therapists to build trust with clients, by salespeople to create rapport with customers, and by skilled conversationalists in social or professional settings. For example, if a person speaks slowly and softly, mirroring their pace and tone, rather than overwhelming them with loud or fast speech, can help foster comfort and trust. Similarly, subtly adopting someone's posture or repeating a phrase they use can reinforce a sense of shared experience. However, mirroring must be done with care. If it becomes too obvious or exaggerated, it can feel mocking or manipulative, breaking the very connection it's meant to build. Effective mirroring is natural, responsive, and always rooted in genuine attentiveness. In essence, mirroring taps into the human longing to be understood without words. It's a quiet affirmation, "I'm with you." In a world often marked by disconnection, this simple act of reflection can become a bridge, not only to better communication but to deeper human connection. Name use. Using a person's name during conversation may seem like a simple act, but it carries profound psychological weight. This technique, often referred to as the name use effect, taps into one of the most powerful and personal cues in human communication: the sound of one's own name. It is more than just identification, it is tied deeply to one's sense of identity, self-worth, and social recognition. From an early age, individuals are conditioned to respond to their names. Neurological studies have shown that hearing one's own name activates unique patterns in the brain, especially in regions associated with self-awareness and attention. This makes a person's name not just a label, but a psychological anchor, something that cuts through distraction and commands attention almost automatically. When you use someone's name in conversation, you are doing more than just addressing them, you are acknowledging them as an individual. This simple gesture conveys familiarity, attentiveness, and respect. It subtly tells the other person, "I see you. I recognize you." In turn, this can build rapport, increase trust, and foster a sense of connection. The effectiveness of name use is especially apparent in social, professional, and customer service settings. A waiter who greets you by name, a manager who remembers a subordinate's name, or a speaker who calls on an audience member by name, all of these scenarios make the individual feel valued and more engaged. Politicians, salespeople, and public speakers frequently use this technique to appear more charismatic and personable. Psychologically, the use of a name also taps into the principle of personalization. People are more likely to pay attention to, respond to, and positively evaluate messages that are personally relevant. That's why hearing your name in a crowd can immediately catch your attention. It slices through background noise like a spotlight. However, there's a balance to be struck. Overusing someone's name can come across as forced or manipulative, especially if done with obvious strategic intent. The key is to use it naturally and sparingly, in moments where it genuinely enhances the connection, such as when greeting someone, emphasizing a point, or expressing appreciation. In essence, name use is a small act with a big impact. It's a reminder that in a world often driven by generalization and anonymity, people still crave to be personally seen and acknowledged. By saying someone's name, and meaning it, you're not just talking to them, you're speaking with them. Precommitment Strategy. The precommitment strategy is a psychological technique that involves intentionally making a decision in advance to limit your future choices, in order to stay aligned with a long-term goal. It's based on the understanding that our future selves are often weaker, more impulsive, and more easily swayed than we'd like to admit. By precommitting, that is, locking in a plan, decision, or consequence ahead of time, we reduce the risk of giving in to temptation, procrastination, or emotional impulses later on. This strategy stems from a fundamental truth about human psychology: we are not perfectly rational beings, and our willpower tends to fluctuate, especially in the face of short-term rewards. Precommitment works by recognizing this flaw and designing structures now to protect us from our weaker future selves. A classic example comes from the Greek myth of Odysseus and the Sirens. Knowing that the Sirens' song would lure him to destruction, Odysseus had his sailors tie him to the mast of his ship and ordered them not to release him, no matter how much he begged. He precommitted himself to a course of action, acknowledging that his future state, entranced by the Sirens, would not align with his current goal, survival. That's the essence of the precommitment strategy, voluntarily restricting future freedom to preserve long-term values. In everyday life, precommitment strategies appear in many forms. Financial goals: automatically transferring part of your paycheck into a savings account or retirement fund before you have the chance to spend it. Productivity: scheduling focus blocks in your calendar, turning off notifications, or using website blockers during work hours to avoid distraction. Health: signing up and paying in advance for fitness classes, or removing junk food from the house to prevent late-night snacking. Social behavior: Publicly stating a goal or deadline to increase accountability, e.g., announcing a launch date or telling friends you're quitting smoking. Psychologically, pre-commitment is a form of self-binding, creating constraints to protect your values from your future impulses. It's a powerful act of self-awareness. By pre-committing, you're acknowledging your vulnerabilities while empowering yourself to overcome them. The effectiveness of pre-commitment is also supported by behavioral economics. Studies have shown that people who make binding decisions in advance, such as using commitment contracts to quit smoking or stick to diets, are far more successful than those who rely solely on willpower. When the path is already chosen and the options are narrowed, it becomes much easier to stay the course. However, for pre-commitment to work, the strategy must be realistic, voluntary, and enforceable. If the constraints are too extreme or feel imposed, the person may rebel or abandon the plan. The best pre-commitments are those that match the person's deeper values and offer meaningful incentives, or consequences, to stay on track. In essence, the pre-commitment strategy is about planning with humility and discipline. It's an act of respect for your future self, recognizing that the greatest threats to your long-term goals often come from within. By making wise decisions today that narrow your options tomorrow, you don't limit your freedom, you preserve your freedom to succeed. Reframing complaints. Reframing complaints is a powerful psychological technique rooted in the art of empathetic communication and cognitive reframing. Instead of reacting defensively or dismissively when someone complains, this approach involves actively listening and then reinterpreting their complaint in a more constructive or emotionally insightful light. The goal is not to deny or contradict their frustration, but to offer a new perspective, one that acknowledges their feelings while shifting the emotional tone of the conversation. At its heart, this method is based on a deep understanding of human emotion. People often complain not just to seek solutions, but to feel heard and validated. When someone vents about a difficult situation, what they often need first is emotional recognition, not immediate advice or correction. Reframing works by taking the underlying need or value hidden within the complaint and expressing it in a more positive, empowering, or meaningful way. For example, consider a colleague who says, "I'm so tired of always being the one who fixes everyone else's mistakes." A direct or logical response might be to sympathize or suggest a change in workflow. But a reframed response might be, "It sounds like you really care about the quality of the work, and you take responsibility for keeping things on track." This doesn't deny their frustration, it transforms it into a statement of strength and values, responsibility, integrity, and commitment. Psychologically, this technique relies on the principles of empathic validation and cognitive reappraisal. By helping the person relabel their experience in a more positive or constructive light, you reduce emotional tension and open the door to more solution-focused thinking. This process can disarm negativity and create a bridge between emotional expression and practical resolution. Reframing also reduces defensiveness. When people feel that their complaint is being heard and honored, even while being gently redirected, they are more likely to engage cooperatively rather than shut down or escalate the issue. In essence, reframing allows for emotional alignment before problem solving. This technique is commonly used by therapists, coaches, managers, and emotionally intelligent communicators. It is especially helpful in conflict resolution, where reframing can shift a conversation from blame to understanding. For example, when a teenager says, "You never let me do anything," a parent might respond, "You want more independence. That makes sense. Let's figure out what that could look like." The complaint is reframed as a desire for autonomy, a legitimate developmental need. Importantly, reframing must be done genuinely and sensitively. If it feels patronizing, dismissive, or too positive too quickly, it can backfire. The tone should be grounded in empathy, curiosity, and respect. In short, reframing complaints is not about ignoring problems, it's about changing the emotional lens through which problems are viewed. By helping others see their frustrations in a new, more empowering light, you not only soothe their distress but also build trust, connection, and emotional resilience. In doing so, you transform moments of negativity into opportunities for insight and growth. Repeat exposure. The mere exposure effect, also known as repeat exposure, is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. In other words, the more we are exposed to something, a person, object, word, song, or idea, the more we tend to like it, even if we had no strong feelings about it to begin with. This effect operates quietly and often unconsciously, influencing our decisions, preferences, and social relationships in subtle but powerful ways. First discovered by social psychologist Robert Zeigarnik in the 1960s, the mere exposure effect shows that familiarity breeds affection, not contempt, as the old saying suggests. In a series of experiments, Zeigarnik demonstrated that people consistently rated nonsense words, unfamiliar faces, or abstract images more positively after repeated exposure. The key insight was that repetition alone, not quality, meaning, or relevance, was enough to increase likability. This tendency is deeply rooted in how the human brain evolved. From a survival standpoint, unfamiliar things were often dangerous, while familiar things were usually safe. Over time, this adaptive bias became hardwired into our psychology. What we recognize, we trust; what we trust, we come to like. Thus, repeated exposure leads to emotional comfort, which then translates into preference. In the real world, the mere exposure effect is everywhere. It helps explain why advertising works. The more often we see a logo, jingle, or product, the more likely we are to choose it, even if we don't consciously remember seeing it. In politics, name recognition alone can sway voters. In relationships, repeated interaction, like classmates, coworkers, or neighbors, often leads to friendships or romantic attraction, simply because familiarity breeds connection. This effect also influences how we view art, music, or literature. A song that sounds odd at first may become a favorite after a few listens. A painting that once felt abstract or confusing may grow on us over time. Repetition allows our brains to process the unfamiliar, reducing cognitive effort and increasing comfort, which we often misinterpret as genuine preference. Interestingly, the mere exposure effect also applies to ourselves. Research has shown that we tend to prefer mirror images of our own faces, while our friends prefer the original version. This is because we most often see ourselves in the mirror, and have become most familiar with that version. However, there are limits. Repetition can lead to boredom or even irritation if the stimulus is negative, too frequent, or overly forced. But when used moderately and naturally, repeat exposure can build trust, influence choices, and strengthen emotional bonds, without any direct persuasion. In essence, the mere exposure effect reminds us that liking often follows familiarity, not the other way around. Whether it's a product, a person, or an idea, seeing it more often, in a non-threatening, low-pressure way, can gradually turn the unfamiliar into the likable, and the likable into the trusted. It's one of the quietest psychological tricks, and one of the most effective. Scarcity Principle. The scarcity principle is a powerful psychological phenomenon rooted in the basic economic law of supply and demand. It suggests that people place higher value on items, opportunities, or information that are perceived to be limited or rare. In essence, the less available something is, the more desirable it becomes, not necessarily because of its inherent quality, but because of its perceived scarcity. This principle taps into a deep-seated human fear of missing out, commonly referred to as FOMO. When individuals believe that something is in short supply, they tend to want it more, fearing that if they don't act quickly, they may lose the chance altogether. This effect can be seen across various domains, from marketing to relationships, from social dynamics to decision-making under pressure. Marketers often exploit the scarcity principle by using phrases like limited time offer, only a few items left in stock, or exclusive membership. These cues trigger an instinctive reaction. The consumer perceives the product or offer as more valuable, not necessarily because of its features, but because it might soon become unavailable. The pressure to act quickly often overrides rational deliberation, pushing individuals to make impulsive decisions. Scarcity can also heighten perceived uniqueness and prestige. A product that is rare or hard to obtain may be seen as more sophisticated or luxurious, appealing to one's sense of identity or social status. For example, limited edition collectibles or invitation-only events carry an allure precisely because not everyone can access them. This principle doesn't just apply to material goods. Information can also become more influential when it's perceived as secret or restricted. When people are told something is confidential or hard to get, they are more likely to believe it and act upon it, even if the content itself is no more credible or useful than publicly available information. In social settings, scarcity can also shape interpersonal relationships. Someone who appears less available, emotionally, socially, or romantically, may be viewed as more attractive or valuable. The sense that their time or attention is limited increases their perceived worth. The scarcity principle is so effective because it plays on both cognitive and emotional biases. It engages our survival instincts. If something is running out, we must secure it before others do. It also short-circuits our analytical thinking, replacing careful evaluation with urgency and desire. Understanding the scarcity principle allows individuals to recognize when they are being influenced by it and to pause before making decisions based solely on perceived limitations. At the same time, it remains a highly effective tool in persuasion and influence when used ethically and strategically. The Pique Technique. The Pique Technique is a subtle yet highly effective psychological trick that works by disrupting people's automatic refusal behavior and sparking curiosity through an unusual or oddly specific request. Unlike typical approaches that ask for something in a conventional way, the Pique Technique makes the request so unexpected that it causes the person to stop, think, and pay closer attention, momentarily interrupting their habitual response pattern. That brief pause can significantly increase the likelihood of compliance. The name pique comes from the idea of piquing someone's interest, capturing their attention by being distinctive. For example, instead of a beggar asking, "Can you spare some change?" a request most people are accustomed to ignoring, they might ask, "Can you spare 37 cents?" That strangely precise figure is jarring. It doesn't match the usual script, so the brain, instead of going into autopilot mode, becomes alert. The listener pauses to process, "Why 37 cents?" That curiosity increases cognitive engagement and opens the door to a more favorable response. This technique was studied in a famous experiment by researchers in the 1990s, who had panhandlers approach strangers with two types of requests. Some asked for a common amount, "Can you spare $1?" while others used the Pique approach, "Can you spare 83 cents?" The oddly specific request generated significantly higher compliance rates. The unexpectedness created just enough mental friction to make people reevaluate their automatic inclination to say no. Psychologically, the Pique technique works through pattern interruption, breaking someone out of their mental routine. We are creatures of habit, and many of our responses, especially in social situations, are rehearsed or unconscious. But when a request doesn't fit the expected pattern, it forces a quick mental reevaluation. What's going on here? Is this different? Should I reconsider? That moment of disruption creates a chance for influence. Beyond panhandling, this method is widely applicable in marketing, fundraising, communication, and even social dynamics. A street fundraiser might say, "Would you consider donating $4.27 to support clean water access," instead of asking for a round figure? An email subject line like 17.5 ways to beat procrastination is more likely to be open than one that says, "How to beat procrastination." In a presentation, leading with a bizarre fact or strangely specific statistic piques attention far more than something generic. The strength of the Pique technique lies in its subtlety. It doesn't rely on pressure, logic, or emotional appeal, it simply makes the listener curious. That curiosity acts as a wedge, opening the door for deeper engagement or a change in behavior. However, it must be used wisely. If the request is too strange or appears manipulative, it can backfire or confuse the listener. The key is to find a sweet spot, unusual enough to stand out, but still believable and relevant. In essence, the Pique technique shows that attention is the gateway to influence. When people are on autopilot, your message is easy to ignore. But if you can briefly break their pattern, even with something as small as an oddly specific number, you can shift the entire interaction from reflex to thought. And in that fleeting moment of awareness, persuasion becomes far more likely. The Zeigarnik Effect. The Zeigarnik Effect is a psychological phenomenon that explains why people tend to remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than those they have finished. First observed by Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, this effect reveals something fundamental about human cognition. Our minds are naturally inclined to seek closure, and when that closure is denied, the unfinished business lingers in our thoughts. Zeigarnik's initial observations came from a casual setting, a cafe in Vienna, where she noticed that waiters had an uncanny ability to remember customers' orders only while the orders were in progress. Once the orders were delivered and paid for, the waiters quickly forgot them. Intrigued, she later confirmed through experiments that people recall incomplete tasks significantly more than completed ones. This effect occurs because an unfinished task creates a kind of psychological tension, an open loop, that the brain keeps active in working memory. The mind seems to maintain this tension as a motivator, pushing the individual to return to and complete the task. Once the task is finished, the tension resolves, and the brain can let go, freeing cognitive resources. The Zeigarnik Effect has several practical and persuasive implications. In motivation and productivity, knowing that unfinished tasks stick in the mind can help structure work more effectively. For instance, starting a project, even with a small, incomplete first step, can create a sense of commitment that motivates one to return and finish it. This is one reason why making a rough outline or writing just the first sentence of an essay can make it easier to keep going later. In education, teachers and learning platforms often use this effect to foster curiosity. By ending a lesson with a compelling question or an unresolved problem, they create a cognitive itch that keeps students mentally engaged and encourages them to return for the answer. In marketing and storytelling, the Zeigarnik Effect is a staple of effective advertising and narrative structure. Cliffhangers in TV shows, suspenseful pauses in storytelling, or, to be continued, teasers all leverage our discomfort with incompleteness. Marketers use this to make audiences return for more, keeping them hooked until the loop is closed. In user experience design, apps and platforms use visual indicators like progress bars or step counters to keep users involved. By showing that a task is partially complete, say, 3 out of 5 profile sections filled in, the system uses the Zeigarnik Effect to nudge users toward finishing the remaining steps. There's also a darker side to the Zeigarnik Effect. Persistent open tasks or unresolved issues can lead to anxiety, insomnia, or overthinking. People often mentally revisit conversations they wish had gone differently, decisions they haven't finalized, or goals left incomplete. In such cases, the effect becomes less a tool for motivation and more a source of mental clutter. To harness the Zeigarnik Effect positively, many psychologists and productivity experts recommend writing down unfinished tasks. This simple act can act as a symbolic form of closure or at least externalize the mental tension, making the task easier to revisit later with clarity. In summary, the Zeigarnik Effect is a reflection of the mind's deep need for resolution and completeness. Whether used to boost focus, influence behavior, or craft compelling narratives, it reveals the power of the unfinished to shape our thoughts, decisions, and actions. Eye contact triangle. Maintaining eye contact is one of the most fundamental elements of effective communication. It conveys confidence, attentiveness, and trust. But too much direct eye contact can feel intimidating or unnatural, while too little can make you seem evasive or uninterested. Striking the right balance is key, and that's where the eye contact triangle comes in. The eye contact triangle is a subtle but powerful technique for managing eye contact in a way that feels natural, engaging, and psychologically comfortable for both parties. The concept is simple. Instead of staring directly into someone's eyes the entire time you're speaking or listening, allow your gaze to gently shift between 3 points on their face: the left eye, the right eye, and the mouth. This triangular movement keeps your attention on their face, but in a way that feels fluid rather than fixed or aggressive. Why does this work? First, from a psychological standpoint, people don't consciously notice your eyes shifting between those 3 points. What they perceive is steady, focused attention, which builds trust and signals active listening. At the same time, this gentle movement prevents your gaze from becoming too intense, which can make the other person feel uncomfortable or defensive. It creates the illusion of deep connection while allowing both you and the other person to feel more at ease. Moreover, the triangle helps maintain engagement and emotional connection. Focusing occasionally on the mouth, for example, subtly draws your attention to facial expressions and emotional cues, making you more in tune with the speaker's tone and feelings. This makes your responses more empathetic and helps you pick up on unspoken social signals. The technique can also be adapted depending on the situation. In professional settings, keeping your gaze primarily on the eyes with occasional shifts to the mouth maintains formality and attentiveness. In more personal or intimate conversations, the triangle creates a stronger sense of emotional closeness without the pressure of a hard stare. Practicing the eye contact triangle is simple. As you talk to someone, softly shift your gaze every few seconds, left eye, right eye, mouth, and back again. Don't overthink it, the movement should feel natural, almost like your gaze is flowing across their face in a relaxed rhythm. In summary, the eye contact triangle is a nuanced psychological trick that enhances communication by creating a sense of connection without crossing into discomfort. It allows you to maintain strong eye contact in a way that feels natural, warm, and confident, a small shift that can make a big difference in how you're perceived. Nod while speaking. One of the simplest yet most effective nonverbal cues in communication is the act of nodding while you speak. Though it may seem trivial, this small gesture taps into deep social and psychological patterns that influence how people respond to us, often without them even realizing it. When you nod your head as you talk, especially while making a statement or suggestion, you are nonverbally signaling agreement and confidence. In human interaction, body language plays a powerful role in shaping perception. A nod conveys affirmation, sincerity, and encouragement. Because humans are naturally inclined to mirror the behavior of those around them, the person you're speaking to may subconsciously begin to mirror your nod, and more importantly, the attitude that comes with it. This mirroring often leads to increased compliance or agreement. Studies in social psychology have shown that people are more likely to say yes or express agreement when exposed to subtle nonverbal affirmations like nodding. It's not about manipulation, it's about creating a sense of harmony and alignment in the conversation. Furthermore, nodding while you speak can enhance the perception of your authority and credibility. It shows that you are confident in what you're saying, that you expect agreement, and that you're engaged and connected to the listener. It's a subtle way of saying, "This is true, and you probably think so too," which can be surprisingly persuasive. Of course, moderation is key. Over-nodding or exaggerated movements can seem unnatural or even suspicious. But when done subtly and purposefully, a gentle nod here and there can reinforce your message, build rapport, and increase the chances that your words will be accepted. In short, nodding while speaking is a quiet but powerful psychological trick, one that helps foster agreement, trust, and connection, all without uttering a single extra word. Notice feet. When it comes to reading people, most of us pay close attention to facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language, but we often overlook one of the most revealing indicators of someone's true feelings, their feet. That's right, if you want to know how someone really feels during a conversation, look at their feet. Feet are often the most honest part of the body, not because they're expressive like the face or hands, but because they're the part we control the least. While we may train ourselves to smile politely or nod in agreement, we rarely think about what our feet are doing, which makes them excellent indicators of unconscious emotions and intentions. Here's the psychological trick: when you approach someone or engage in a conversation, observe the direction of their feet. If their feet point toward you, it's a strong sign that they're open, interested, or engaged. If only their upper body is facing you, but their feet are angled away, toward a door, another person, or simply turned to the side, it can indicate discomfort, disinterest, or a desire to leave the interaction. In group settings, this cue becomes even more useful. Let's say you join a group conversation at a social event. If the group subtly shifts their stance so that their feet form a more open circle including you, it's a welcoming gesture. But if their feet remain angled away or they only partially turn toward you, it may suggest that you're entering an already closed-off dynamic, and they may not be open to new participants. Feet can also give you clues in more nuanced interactions. For instance, during a tense conversation, someone may be smiling and nodding while their feet are subtly stepping backward or turning to the side. That's your subconscious clue that they're uncomfortable and want the interaction to end, even if their words or facial expressions say otherwise. This insight can be invaluable not only in social situations but in business, negotiations, and conflict resolution. Imagine you're pitching an idea in a meeting. If someone's body faces you but their feet consistently point toward the exit, you may have already lost their attention or agreement, even if they haven't said so. The beauty of this trick is that it doesn't require confrontation or questioning. By quietly observing foot direction, you gain an honest read on someone's engagement level and emotional state. It helps you adjust your communication, whether that means backing off, redirecting the conversation, or leaning in further, based on subtle, unconscious signals they're already giving you. In short, the next time you want to know what someone is really thinking, don't just watch their eyes or listen to their words. Look down. Their feet might be telling you the truth. Pause before responding. In conversations, especially those that are important, emotional, or high stakes, there's one subtle habit that can significantly shift how others perceive you: pausing briefly before you respond. Though it might seem like a small thing, that short moment of silence sends a powerful message. It's a psychological trick that can make you appear more thoughtful, more confident, and more emotionally intelligent, all without saying a word. Most people are in a rush to respond. We often listen not to understand, but to reply. In doing so, we may interrupt, speak too quickly, or blurt out half-formed thoughts. But when you pause for just a second or two before answering, you signal something different. You show that you're processing the other person's words, that you're thinking carefully, and that you're not rushing to judgment. This deliberate pause creates several positive effects. First, it makes you appear more confident and composed. People who are nervous tend to speak quickly and fill silence. Those who are secure in themselves can sit comfortably with a bit of silence, which reads as calm and self-assured. Your words carry more weight because they don't feel reactive, they feel considered. Second, a pause invites deeper communication. It slows down the pace of the conversation, giving both parties room to think and feel. This is especially valuable in emotionally charged situations, where immediate reactions can escalate tension. A moment of quiet can cool things down and open the door to empathy rather than conflict. Third, when you pause, you often gain more control over the direction of the conversation. That tiny silence shifts the energy. People tend to fill gaps in conversation quickly, so your pause may prompt the other person to say more, often revealing things they hadn't planned to share. This gives you more insight and puts you in a stronger position to respond meaningfully. Interestingly, this trick is especially effective in professional environments. Whether you're answering a question in a meeting, responding to feedback, or negotiating, a thoughtful pause before speaking can make you seem strategic, deliberate, and emotionally balanced. It also prevents you from saying something impulsive that you might later regret. Pausing before responding isn't about being dramatic or robotic. It's about cultivating presence and intentionality. Even a half-second of stillness can transform your role in a conversation from reactive to composed, from rushed to respectful. So the next time you're asked a question, especially one that matters, resist the urge to reply instantly. Take a breath. Let the silence speak first. You'll be surprised how much more powerful your voice becomes when it's preceded by thoughtful stillness. Make people feel heard. In any conversation, whether it's personal, professional, or even casual, one of the most powerful ways to build trust and influence is to make the other person feel truly heard. This psychological trick isn't about agreeing with them or solving their problems. It's about showing that you genuinely understand what they're expressing. It's subtle, but the impact is profound. At its core, making someone feel heard satisfies a fundamental human need, the need for validation. People want to know that their thoughts, feelings, and experiences matter. When they sense that they're being listened to attentively and without judgment, their defenses lower. They become more open, cooperative, and trusting, which makes communication far more effective. The trick lies in how you respond to what they say. Instead of just nodding or saying, "I understand," try reflecting their message back to them in your own words. This is called active listening. For example, if someone says, "I've been so overwhelmed at work lately," a powerful response would be, "It sounds like your workload's been a lot to handle lately, and it's starting to wear you down." This not only shows that you were listening, but also that you understood the meaning behind their words. This kind of reflection taps into what psychologists call empathetic accuracy, the ability to accurately read and acknowledge another person's emotions. When people feel that their emotions are being recognized, not dismissed or glossed over, they're more likely to calm down, open up, or cooperate. Another way to make someone feel heard is to ask thoughtful follow-up questions. This shows genuine interest and keeps the conversation focused on them, reinforcing that you're engaged. Avoid interrupting, offering premature advice, or hijacking the conversation with your own experiences. These are all common habits that unintentionally signal disinterest or self-centeredness. What's especially interesting about this trick is that you don't have to agree with the person to make them feel heard. You can acknowledge someone's perspective without endorsing it. Phrases like, "I can see how that would be frustrating," or, "That makes sense, given what you're going through," communicate respect, even if you ultimately have a different viewpoint. Making people feel heard isn't just about kindness, it's strategically effective. It strengthens relationships, diffuses conflict, and gives you greater influence in conversations. When people feel respected and emotionally safe, they are far more likely to listen in return. In short, the key to this trick is presence. By slowing down, listening fully, reflecting back, and responding with empathy, you send a powerful message: you matter. I see you. I hear you. And in a world where everyone wants to be heard, that message is irresistible. Give a reason, even a bad one. One of the most surprising yet powerful psychological tricks in human interaction is the use of a reason, any reason, when making a request. Whether you're asking someone to do a favor, grant permission, or make an exception, adding a reason significantly increases the chances that they'll say yes. What's most fascinating is that the reason itself doesn't even need to be particularly strong or logical, it just needs to be there. This phenomenon was famously demonstrated in a study by psychologist Ellen Langer in the 1970s. In a now classic experiment, researchers approached people waiting to use a photocopier and tested different ways of asking to cut in line. When the request was made without any explanation, "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine?" about 60% of people agreed. But when a reason was added, even something trivial like, "Because I have to make copies," compliance jumped to over 90%. Despite the fact that everyone in line needed to make copies, the simple presence of the word "because" triggered an automatic, agreeable response. This is due to how the human brain processes information. Much of our day-to-day decision-making operates on mental shortcuts, or heuristics, that help us function efficiently without deep analysis of every small interaction. When we hear the structure of a reasoned request, "Can I do X because Y?" our brains often interpret it as legitimate, even before evaluating the actual content. The word "because" acts as a psychological switch that activates our tendency to comply, especially in low-stakes situations. In practice, this means that when you're trying to influence someone, whether it's asking a colleague for help, requesting an extension, or trying to persuade a stranger, always provide a reason, even if it's not especially compelling. "Could you help me with this, because I'm trying to finish it today?" or "Mind if I sit here, because I prefer the window," are far more effective than just the bare request. Of course, this tactic works best in situations where the request is reasonable and the stakes are relatively low. In more complex or high-stakes contexts, people may scrutinize the reason more closely. But for everyday interactions, the principle remains: giving a reason, even a weak one, dramatically increases compliance. So next time you're asking for something, don't stop at the request. Add a "because." You might be surprised how often it works.